and Novak.
This is VOA News. I'm Joe Ramsey. The International Monetary Fund says the global economy's outlook has dimmed amid high inflation, rising interest rates, and two big American bank failures, AP Washington correspondent Sagar Magani reports.
The situation remains fragile.
Chief economist Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas says the IMF has downgraded its global growth outlook below 3%.
Downside risks dominate,
saying the possibility of rising interest rates leading to recession has gone up sharply, especially in the world's wealthiest countries. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen sees it differently.
I wouldn't overdo the negativism,
saying the global outlook is reasonably bright. And while Yellen's not expecting a downturn,
of course that remains a risk.
Sagar Magani, Washington.
Ukraine's energy minister says the country has begun resuming electricity exports to European countries, a dramatic turnaround from just 6 months ago. That's when fierce Russian bombardment of power stations plunged much of the country into darkness in a bid to demoralize the population. The announcement that Ukraine was not only meeting domestic needs but also ready to restart exports was a clear message that Moscow's attempt to weaken Kyiv is not working. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin on Tuesday said the United States will investigate the recent purported leak of classified documents until the source of them was found.
I was first briefed on the reports of unauthorized disclosure of sensitive and classified material on the morning of April 6th. And since then, I've been convening senior department leaders daily on our response, and I've directed an urgent cross-department effort.
Investigators are working to determine who might have leaked it. This is VOA News. A Myanmar witness who is a member of a local pro-democracy group say airstrikes by the military have killed as many as 100 people, including children. AP correspondent Charles De Ledesma reports.
The witness has told the Associated Press that a fighter jet dropped bombs directly into a crowd of people who were gathering at 8 a.m. for the opening of a local office of the country's opposition movement outside a village in an area known as Kanbalu Township, north of Mandalay, the country's second largest city. The witness added, a little later, a helicopter appeared and fired at the site. The military is increasingly using airstrikes to counter an armed struggle against its rule, which began in February 2021, seizing power from the elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi. I'm Charles de Ledesma.
Women's basketball star Brittany Griner is set to share her story about the nearly 10 months she spent incarcerated in Russia. AP correspondent Gethin Kulba reports.
Brittany Griner is ready to share her, quote, unfathomable story about the nearly 10 months she spent incarcerated in Russia. The WNBA star says she is working on a memoir that is scheduled for release in the spring of 2024. Griner was arrested last year at the airport in Moscow on drug-related charges and detained for nearly 10 months, much of that time in prison. Griner was freed last December 8th in exchange for the notorious Russian arms dealer Viktor Bout. Her plight unfolded at the same time Russia invaded Ukraine and further heightened tensions between Russia and the U.S. I'm Gethin Kulba.
2 more people have been sentenced for their roles in the January 6, 2021 U.S. Capitol riot, the AP's Ed Donahue reports.
Retired firefighter Robert Sanford was sentenced to more than 4 years in prison. He threw a fire extinguisher that hit 2 police officers in the head. Also, Josiah Kenyon was sentenced to 6 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution for damaging a window at the Capitol on the day of the riot. Kenyon was dressed as the character Jack Skellington from the movie The Nightmare Before Christmas. Prosecutors say he used a table leg with a protruding nail to strike an officer in the leg and hit a second officer so hard it lodged in the officer's face shield and helmet. Ed Donahue, Washington.
New York City's Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg on Tuesday sued Republican U.S. Representative Jim Jordan to stop what Bragg called a campaign of intimidation against the criminal prosecution of former President Donald Trump in New York. The lawsuit aims to block a subpoena of Mark Pomerantz, a former prosecutor who once led the Manhattan District Attorney's multi-year investigation of Trump by the Republican-led House of Representatives Judiciary Committee, which Jordan chairs. I'm Joe Ramsey. This is VOA News. I'm Joe Ramsey. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin welcomed Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal to the Defense Department's Pentagon headquarters near Washington on Wednesday.
So I'm confident that we will meet Ukraine's defense needs through this spring and beyond. And as the President has repeatedly made clear, we will stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes.
The visit comes as U.S. national security agencies are investigating the release of dozens of classified documents that first appeared on social media sites in March and supposedly revealed details of military capabilities of some U.S. adversaries and allies, including Ukraine. Moscow's passing a bill to make it easier and quicker to conscript and draft army recruits. AP correspondent Charles de Ledesma reports.
The upper house of Russia's parliament has approved a bill that would allow authorities to issue electronic summonses to draftees and reservists amid the fighting in Ukraine. Moscow's current military service rules require the in-person delivery of notices to those who are called up for duty. In the past, many Russians avoided the draft by staying away from their address of record, and the proposed bill would close that loophole. The legislation has been put on fast track as the Russian military is preparing for an expected Ukrainian counter-offensive, which Ukraine and its Western allies say could start within weeks. I'm Charles de Ledesma.
U.S. President Joe Biden received a rock star-like welcome on Wednesday in Dundalk, a town in the Irish county where his mother's family was from. Earlier in the day, he visited the seaside Irish village of Carlingford, where hundreds of people stood in the cold, wet, and windy weather to welcome the president. He's visiting Ireland in part to trace his Irish heritage, where he toured a castle. This is VOA News. More than 2 months after the earthquake in Turkey and Syria that killed more than 50,000 people, millions of survivors are still living in tents with little hope of returning home anytime soon. Henry Ridgewell reports.
Yunus Emre Yildiz and his family live in a tent in Hatay province. They have spent 2 months living outside in Turkey's bitter late winter. Yildiz said, living in a tent is not like living in a house. There are difficulties living in a tent. There are stones on the ground. It is cold. It rains. Nearby, Yildiz's home is still standing. He says the damage isn't sufficient to qualify his family for a place in a better equipped camp for earthquake survivors. Fear keeps them from returning home. Henry Ridgewell for VOA News.
Residents in northern Ethiopia's Amhara region say local fighters have briefly taken over a police station and seized weapons amid ongoing clashes between protesters and the military. Maya Misika reports from Addis Ababa.
In the Amhara region town of Mazezo, residents say they heard heavy gunfire early Wednesday as armed Amhara fighters took over a police station. One resident who did not want to be identified due to security concerns told VOA the fighters were after a delivery of weapons. He says at around 4 a.m. there was heavy gunfire at the police station and bullets were raining down on their roofs. Protests and clashes erupted in Ethiopia's Amhara region last week after the government ordered regional forces like Fano to integrate into the federal military or police. Maya Misakar for VOA News, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Officials expect a massive industrial fire in the U.S. Midwestern state of Indiana that's forcing evacuations to continue to smolder. AP correspondent Julie Walker reports.
Thick black smoke billowed in the sky when the fire first broke out Tuesday, something Richmond Mayor Dave Snow blames on the business owner for ignoring cleanup orders.
This person has been negligent and irresponsible, and it's led to putting a lot of people in danger.
The site was storing plastics inside and out for recycling. The EPA says so far toxins are not being emitted into the air, but County Health Director Christine Stinson says particulate matter is a concern.
These are very fine particles, and if they're breathed in, can cause all kinds of respiratory problems.
Audio courtesy WRTV. I'm Julie Walker.
Prince Harry will attend the coronation in London of his father, King Charles III, but without his wife, Meghan, Buckingham Palace said on Wednesday. The announcement follows weeks of uncertainty over the presence of Harry and Meghan, who have launched a barrage of criticism of the British royal family since announcing they were quitting royal duties in early 2020. I'm Joe Ramsey, VOA.
This is VOA News. I'm Marissa Melton. A Massachusetts Air National Guard member has been arrested in the case of highly classified military documents leaked online. AP Washington correspondent Sagar Magani has the story.
Heavily armed federal agents took 21-year-old Jack Teixeira into custody outside his home.
Teixeira is an employee of the United States Air Force National Guard.
An intelligence specialist whom Attorney General Merrick Garland says will be charged with unauthorized removal of classified national defense information. Investigators believe Teixeira led an online chat group where the documents about the Ukraine war were posted.
This was a deliberate criminal act.
Pentagon spokesman Pat Ryder referred all questions to Garland's Justice Department about the highest profile intelligence leak in years. The Biden administration's been scrambling to contain the fallout. Sagar Magani, Washington.
North Korea said on Friday it's tested a new solid-fuel intercontinental ballistic missile meant to radically promote the country's nuclear counterattack capability. State media on Friday warned of extreme uneasiness and horror to enemies. South Korea said Thursday that Pyongyang had fired what appeared to be a new model ballistic missile, triggering a scare in northern Japan, where Hokkaido residents were told to take cover, though there turned out to be no danger. If North Korea's report is true, analysts say it would mark the North's first use of solid propellants in an intermediate range or intercontinental ballistic missile. Experts say a solid fuel ICBM could help the North deploy its missiles faster in the event of a war. You can keep up on that story and all the stories we're covering at our website, voanews.com. This is VOA News. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba on Thursday urged Western nations to develop a consistent Black Sea strategy to push out Russia from the region. VOA's Jeff Custer reports.
Speaking via video link to a conference on Black Sea security in Romania, Kuleba called for a comprehensive security network for all nations in the region who feel threatened by Russian President Vladimir Putin, whom he referred to as the maniac on the loose. He said it was time to turn the Black Sea into a Sea of NATO.
I regret to say it, but I believe the West had no consistent Black Sea strategy, while Russia has always had one: aggressive, revanchist, and barbaric.
A Kremlin spokesman Tuesday responded to Kuleba's comments, saying the Black Sea will never be a Sea of NATO. Jeff Custer, VOA News, Washington.
Florida lawmakers have tightened the state's abortion restrictions, voting to ban the procedure after 6 weeks of pregnancy. AP correspondent Jackie Quinn has that story.
The GOP-controlled Florida legislature has already banned abortions after 15 weeks. This new measure further closes the window to just 6. Critics say that's often before a woman even knows she's pregnant. But Governor Ron DeSantis, a potential presidential candidate, indicates that he supports it, just as he did the previous ban last April.
Provide protections for unborn children from abortion.
There is a court challenge to the 15-week abortion ban, which added Florida to the list of southern states working to outlaw the procedure. Florida's bill does allow exemptions for the mother's life and cases of rape or incest. I'm Jackie Quinn.
Diplomatic sources said Thursday that foreign ministers from the group of 7 nations will use talks in Japan next week to assess their strategy in the Middle East. The U.S. and its main European allies were caught unprepared in March after China brokered a deal between regional foes Saudi Arabia and Iran to revive diplomatic relations after years of bitter rivalry that has fueled conflict across the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is also pressing ahead with efforts to thaw bilateral ties with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. It would join several other Arab states in moving to formally end Syria's regional isolation. And Ghana became the first country to approve a new malaria vaccine for young children that may offer better protection against the disease, which kills hundreds of thousands of people every year. Young children from ages 5 months to 36 months are the group at highest risk of death from malaria. Once again, you can keep up on that story and all the stories we cover at our website, voanews.com. From Washington, I'm Marissa Melton, VOA News.
Thompson.
And I'm Dan Novak.
This is VOA News. I'm Marissa Melton. The NRA's national convention started Friday in Indianapolis. AP correspondent Donna Warder reports.
For the second year in a row, the National Rifle Association will hold its conference within days of mass shootings in the U.S. Last year, it was the elementary school shooting in Uvalde, Texas. This year, the deadly shootings at a Nashville elementary school and a Louisville, Kentucky bank. The three-day gathering will include thousands of the NRA's most active members and is attracting some top Republican presidential candidates and those considering a run. Former President Donald Trump will be speaking, and his Secret Service protection means attendees cannot have guns at the convention. Former Vice President Mike Pence will be there, and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is speaking through video conference. The NRA calls the convention one of the most politically significant and popular events in the country. I'm Donna Warder.
At least 8 people were killed and 21 were wounded on Friday in a Russian airstrike in the eastern Ukrainian city of Sloviansk, northwest of Bakhmut. That news came from Pavlo Kirilenko. Pavlo Kirilenko, a governor of Donetsk, speaking on national television Friday, he said 7 missiles had been fired on the city. Ukrainian National Police said S-300 missiles struck 10 apartment buildings and other sites. The top 2 floors of a 5-story building collapsed after the strike. Rescue teams were looking for survivors. Kirilenko said people were believed to be trapped under the debris, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky tweeted on Friday that not a single hour of this week passed without murders and terror. This is VOA News. Ukraine secured promises this week of $5 billion in additional funding to support its ongoing fight against Russia. That news came from Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal on Friday after meetings in Washington this week. Shmyhal met with representatives of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the European Investment Bank, as well as top U.S. officials on the sidelines of the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. He said Ukraine received new pledges of additional support from Switzerland, Denmark, and other countries during those meetings. He said there was also an agreement from U.S. aircraft maker Boeing to relieve Ukrainian companies of $200 million in previous commitments. Conservative U.S. Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito on Friday temporarily halted lower court rulings that set up limits on access to the abortion pill mifepristone, giving the nation's top judicial body time to weigh a bid by President Joe Biden's administration to defend the drug from a challenge by anti-abortion groups. Reuters' Jillian Kitchener has more.
Conservative Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito temporarily halted lower court rulings that set limits on access to a widely used abortion pill. That gives the nation's top court, which has a 6-3 conservative majority, time to weigh a bid by the Department of Justice defending the drug. The move by Alito, who handles emergency matters arising from a group of states, including Texas, maintains the current availability of mifepristone, at least for now. The Justice Department and the abortion drugs manufacturer filed emergency requests earlier on Friday, asking the justices to put on hold a ruling by a federal district judge in Texas that would restrict the pill's access while litigation proceeds.
As Reuters' Jillian Kitchener reporting, Germany is phasing out its final remaining 3 nuclear power stations, ending a 6-decade program that spawned one of Europe's strongest protest movements, but saw a brief reprieve due to the Ukraine war. Reuters' Olivia Zellino reports.
Germany is pulling the plug on nuclear energy, ending a 6-decade-long program that saw one of Europe's strongest protest movements. Germany pledged to quit nuclear power following the 2011 Fukushima disaster in Japan. Once responsible for a third of Germany's energy production, it made up just 6% of it last year, compared to 44% from renewables.
And a French court on Friday convicted 11 alleged members of the Kurdistan Workers' Party on charges of terror financing for its campaign to seek autonomy for the minority in Turkey's southeast. Marissa Melton, VOA News.